In the autumn of 1979, the small village of Woodhull, Iowa, nestled amid sprawling cornfields, exuded a quiet serenity, disturbed only by the occasional rustle of dry leaves carried by cool winds. The village, with its modest homes and single general store, revolved around a tight-knit community where everyone knew each other's names and stories. At the edge of Woodhull stood the Catholic monastery of St. Catherine, a stone structure with ivy-clad walls and a small bell tower, serving as the spiritual heart of the region. Its presence offered solace to farmers, shopkeepers, and families who gathered for Sunday Mass or sought guidance in times of hardship. Within its walls lived 3 nuns, each dedicated to a life of prayer and service, their routines as predictable as the seasons. Sister Margaret Wilson, at 62, was the eldest, a woman of gentle demeanor whose lined face bore the wisdom of decades spent in devotion. Her hands, calloused from years of tending the monastery's garden, moved with precision as she planted herbs or distributed food to the needy. Sister Clara Henderson, 55, carried a quiet strength, her sharp mind often occupied with teaching catechism to the village children. Her laughter, rare but warm, echoed through the monastery's halls during moments of shared joy. The youngest, Sister Elizabeth Thorne, only 24, radiated an earnest faith that inspired those around her. Her bright eyes and quick smile masked a deep resolve, forged through a childhood marked by loss and a calling she had felt since her teens. Together, the 3 women formed a small but vital part of Woodhull's fabric, their lives intertwined with the village's rhythms. On a crisp October evening, after the Vespers service had concluded, the 3 nuns prepared for a brief spiritual retreat. The diocese had tasked them with visiting an abandoned chapel perched on a wooded hill several miles from Woodhull, a relic from the early 1900s that had once served a scattered Catholic population. The chapel, with its weathered wooden beams and cracked stained glass windows, had fallen into disrepair, its pews coated in dust and its altar bare. The nuns were to spend 2 days there, fasting and praying in solitude, while assessing whether the structure could be restored or should be decommissioned. Sister Margaret packed a small basket with essentials, bread, water, and candles, while Sister Clara gathered notebooks to document the chapel's condition. Sister Elizabeth, entrusted with recording the state of the building's interior, tucked a camera into her satchel, her heart alight with the prospect of serving God in this sacred task. The nuns set out under a starlit sky, their black habits blending into the darkness as they followed a narrow dirt path through the fields. The air carried the scent of earth and pine, and the distant hoot of an owl accompanied their silent journey. They reached the chapel just before midnight, its silhouette looming against the hill's crest. Inside, they lit candles, their flickering flames casting shadows across the peeling walls. The nuns knelt in prayer, their voices soft as they recited the rosary, seeking strength for the days ahead. They settled into a small room adjacent to the sanctuary, spreading blankets on the floor and arranging their belongings with care. The night passed uneventfully, the chapel enveloped in an eerie stillness. The following morning, a local farmer named Henry Cobb arrived at the chapel, his truck rattling along the uneven path. He had promised to deliver fresh supplies, milk, apples, and a loaf of bread, to sustain the nuns during their retreat. As he approached, he noticed an unsettling quiet, the absence of the usual sounds of morning prayer or movement. The chapel door stood slightly ajar, creaking as he pushed it open. Inside, he found the sanctuary empty, the candles burned to stubs, and the nuns' blankets neatly folded but abandoned. Their satchels, prayer books, and even Sister Elizabeth's camera were gone, as if they had never been there. The altar cloth lay undisturbed, and the air felt heavy, untouched by any sign of violence or haste. Henry's heart sank as he searched the chapel's tiny rooms and the surrounding clearing. Calling out to the nuns in vain. The forest beyond the hill yielded no clues, no footprints, no broken branches, no trace of the women who had walked the path hours earlier. Alarmed, he drove back to Woodhull and alerted the sheriff's department. Within hours, a small team of deputies descended on the chapel, combing the area with flashlights and dogs. They scoured the dense woods, checked nearby streams, and questioned farmers whose lands bordered the hill. The search extended into the night, volunteers from Woodhull joining the effort, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. Yet, despite their diligence, no evidence emerged, no scraps of clothing, no personal items, no indication of where the nuns had gone. The village of Woodhull, unaccustomed to such mysteries, buzzed with unease. In the general store and at the diner, whispers spread among the residents. Some speculated that a pack of wolves, known to roam the nearby forests, had attacked the nuns, though the absence of blood or remains made this theory tenuous. Others, emboldened by late-night conversations, suggested the nuns had fled their vows, abandoning their calling for a life beyond the monastery's walls. A few, their imaginations fueled by superstition, spoke of ghostly forces tied to the chapel's long history, claiming the hill was cursed. These rumors, though dismissed by the church, took root in the community, sowing doubt and fear. Father James Thorne, the village priest and Elizabeth's older brother, stood at the center of the storm. At 32, he was a man of quiet conviction, his sermons known for their sincerity rather than flair. The loss of his sister, whom he had raised after their parents' death in a car accident, struck him like a physical blow. He had supported Elizabeth's decision to join the monastery, seeing in her a faith deeper than his own, yet now he questioned whether he had failed to protect her. In the days following the disappearance, James led prayers at St. Catherine's, his voice steady despite the grief that gnawed at him. He walked the path to the chapel daily, retracing his sister's steps, searching for answers where none existed. At night, alone in the rectory, he knelt before a crucifix, pleading for a miracle, his faith tested by the silence that answered his prayers. The police investigation, hampered by limited resources and rudimentary forensic techniques, yielded no breakthroughs. The sheriff, a pragmatic man named Walter Klein, concluded that the nuns had likely wandered into the woods and succumbed to the elements, though he admitted the lack of evidence made any theory speculative. As weeks turned to months, the case grew cold, the files relegated to a dusty cabinet in the sheriff's office. Woodhull mourned, its residents holding candlelight vigils and hanging ribbons on the monastery's gate. For Father James, the pain of loss became a constant companion, his sister's absence a wound that refused to heal. The chapel on the hill, once a place of reverence, fell into further ruin, its walls crumbling under the weight of an unsolved mystery. The years slipped by in Woodhull, Iowa, and the mystery of the missing nuns hardened into a somber legend, whispered in hushed tones by firelight or recounted to curious newcomers at the village diner. By 2004, the once vibrant community had faded, its edges softened by time and change. The younger generation had drifted to cities like Des Moines or Cedar Rapids, seeking opportunities beyond the endless cornfields, leaving behind aging farmers and retirees who clung to memories of a livelier past. The general store still stood, its shelves stocked with the same brands of flour and canned goods, but its wooden floor creaked under fewer footsteps. The monastery of St. Catherine, though maintained by a dwindling congregation, bore the weight of neglect, its stone walls streaked with moss and its garden overgrown with weeds where Sister Margaret's herbs once thrived. Father James Thorne, now in his late 50s, remained a steadfast presence in the village's church, his clerical collar slightly frayed but his commitment unshaken. His hair had turned silver, and deep lines etched his face, carved by decades of grief and unanswered questions. Each October, on the anniversary of the nun's disappearance, he led a memorial mass at St. Catherine's, his voice steady as he prayed for Sister Margaret Wilson, Sister Clara Henderson, and his sister, Sister Elizabeth Thorne. The pews, once filled with somber faces, now held only a handful of parishioners, gray-haired locals like Henry Cobb, the farmer who had discovered the empty chapel, and a few devout widows who lit candles for the lost women. James stood at the altar, his hands trembling slightly as he raised the chalice, his heart heavy with the ritual's repetition. The service ended with the same hymn each year, its mournful notes echoing through the nearly empty church, a reminder of a wound that refused to close. In the solitude of his rectory, James kept a wooden box, its surface polished by years of reverent handling. Inside lay relics of Elizabeth's life, a photograph of her at her final vows, her face radiant beneath a white veil, a letter she had written at 16, confessing her calling to the religious life, and a small cross she had carved from cedar as a child, a gift to him before she entered the monastery. He opened the box often, tracing the edges of the photographs with his fingertips, as if the act could summon her back. Guilt gnawed at him, a persistent shadow that darkened his prayers. He had encouraged Elizabeth's vocation, marveling at her faith, but now he wondered if his pride had blinded him to dangers he should have foreseen. Had he pushed her toward a path that led to her vanishing? The question haunted him, surfacing in sleepless nights when he knelt before his bedside crucifix, seeking forgiveness for failures he could not name. Woodhull's landscape had shifted over the decades, mirroring its social decline. The dirt path to the hilltop chapel, once well-trodden, had succumbed to nature's reclaiming hand, overgrown with thistles and tangled vines. The chapel itself, abandoned since 1979, stood in partial ruin, its roof caved in and its stained glass windows shattered by storms. Teenagers sometimes ventured there, daring each other to spend a night among the ghosts they believed lingered, but most villagers avoided the place, its silence too heavy with unresolved sorrow. The rumors that had flared in the wake of the disappearance had settled into folklore, tales of a bear attack, though no tracks were ever found, whispers that the nuns had fled to start new lives, despite their devotion, and eerie stories of spectral figures seen on the hill at dusk, clad in black habits. James dismissed these as fanciful, yet he could not shake the sense that the chapel held secrets, locked away in its decaying walls. On the morning of the 25th anniversary, James woke with a restlessness he could not explain. His dreams had been vivid, filled with fleeting images of Elizabeth's face and the sound of her voice reciting the Hail Mary. After breakfast, he donned his black cassock and set out for the church, intending to prepare for the memorial service. But as he passed the window overlooking the fields, his gaze drifted to the distant hill where the chapel stood. An inexplicable urge stirred within him, a pull as tangible as a hand on his shoulder, urging him to visit the place he had avoided for years. The idea seemed foolish, decades of searches had uncovered nothing, but he could not resist. He gathered his coat, a flashlight, and a small Bible, slipping the photograph of Elizabeth into his pocket as a talisman, and began the trek to the hill. The journey was arduous, the path nearly unrecognizable under a carpet of wild grass and fallen branches. James moved slowly, his knees aching from years of kneeling in prayer, his breath visible in the cool autumn air. The forest that bordered the hill had grown denser, its pines casting long shadows across his path. As he climbed, memories flooded back. Elizabeth's laughter as they played in these woods as children, her solemn promise to serve God, her final wave before she left for the retreat. The chapel came into view, its skeletal frame a stark contrast against the gray sky. The walls, once whitewashed, were stained with mildew, and the bell tower leaned precariously, as if one strong wind might topple it. James paused at the threshold, crossing himself before stepping inside. The interior was a hollow shell, the pews rotted, and the altar stripped bare. Dust motes danced in the slants of light that pierced the broken roof, and the air smelled of damp wood and decay. James walked the length of the sanctuary, his footsteps echoing in the stillness, his mind replaying the last moments his sister might have spent here. He knelt where the nuns had prayed, his fingers brushing the cold stone floor, and whispered a prayer for guidance. Rising, he wandered to the clearing outside, where the nuns had once sat for a photograph, their faces serene in the faded image he carried. The clearing was now choked with weeds, the oak tree they had rested beneath long since felled by lightning. As he turned to leave, a glint of metal caught his eye, half buried in the tall grass near the chapel's foundation. He bent down, parting the stalks, and uncovered a rusted grate, its iron bars weathered but intact, set flush with the earth, a discovery that sent a chill through him, for he had never seen it before. The metallic grate, half hidden in the grass, seemed to pulse with a silent challenge, its presence an anomaly that Father James Thorne could not ignore. Driven by a potent mix of hope and desperation, he resolved to uncover its secrets, convinced it held the key to his sister's fate. The discovery had shaken him, stirring a dormant resolve that had lain buried beneath years of grief. He returned to the rectory that evening, his mind racing, and retrieved a worn address book from his desk. His fingers traced the faded ink until he found the name of William Crowe, the retired sheriff who had led the initial search for the nuns in 1979. Crowe, now in his late 70s, lived on the outskirts of Woodhull, in a modest farmhouse surrounded by fields he no longer tilled. James had not spoken to him in years, but he remembered the man's dogged determination during those frantic early days, and he hoped that same tenacity lingered. The next morning, James drove to Crowe's home, the photograph of Elizabeth tucked in his pocket like a talisman. Crowe, his face weathered and his frame stooped, listened as James recounted the discovery at the chapel. Skepticism clouded the old sheriff's eyes, but the priest's earnestness, coupled with the weight of an unsolved case that still haunted him, softened his reluctance. He agreed to accompany James back to the hill, though he warned that decades of exposure might have erased any meaningful clues. James, undeterred, rallied a small group of volunteers from the village. Henry Cobb, the farmer who had first raised the alarm in 1979, and a pair of younger men from the congregation, eager to help despite their unfamiliarity with the old mystery. Armed with crowbars, flashlights, and a shared sense of purpose, the group gathered at the chapel ruins under a sky heavy with clouds. The grate, rusted but sturdy, resisted their initial efforts, its edges fused to the earth by years of neglect. Henry, his hands calloused from decades of labor, wedged a crowbar beneath the metal, while the others leaned their weight into the task. With a groan of protest, the grate yielded, revealing a dark, yawning hole beneath. A musty odor rose from the opening, carrying the scent of damp stone and decay. James shone his flashlight into the void, its beam illuminating a narrow tunnel that descended into the hill. The walls, roughly hewn from bedrock, bore the marks of crude tools, and wooden beams, splintered with age, propped up the ceiling at uneven intervals. The sight sent a shiver through James, a visceral confirmation that this was no natural formation but a deliberate construction, hidden from the world above. Crowe, his instincts rekindled, took the lead, easing himself into the tunnel with a caution born of experience. James followed, his heart pounding, the Bible in his coat pocket a steadying weight. The volunteers trailed behind, their flashlights casting erratic shadows that danced across the stone. As they descended, James's eyes caught faint etchings on the walls, crosses. Simple but deliberate, carved into the rock. Some bore the intricate curves of a rosary, others the outline of a dove or a chalice, symbols of faith that seemed to glow in the dim light. His breath caught as he recognized the precision of the carvings, a testament to patience and devotion. These were no random markings but the work of the nuns, a silent cry from their captivity that pierced his soul with both hope and dread. The tunnel stretched deeper, its air growing colder and heavier, until it opened into a small chamber, no larger than a modest cell. The group paused, their flashlights sweeping the space, revealing a scene of stark deprivation. A straw mattress, brittle and stained, lay against one wall, its fibers crumbling at the touch. A handful of wax stubs, remnants of long burned candles, sat on a crude ledge carved into the stone. A wooden cross, its surface smoothed by countless hands, hung above the mattress, secured by a single rusted nail. On the floor, scattered like fallen leaves, were scraps of black fabric, frayed and faded but unmistakably remnants of the nuns' habits. James knelt beside the mattress, his fingers brushing the cloth, and a wave of nausea washed over him. This was no sanctuary but a prison, a place where his sister and her companions had been held against their will. Crowe examined the chamber with a practiced eye, noting the absence of tools or weapons, the meticulous cleanliness despite the decay. He pointed out scratches on the walls, faint tallies that suggested the passage of days or weeks, a desperate attempt to mark time in darkness. James, his hands trembling, traced one of the crosses, its edges worn smooth, and whispered a prayer for strength. The realization that Elizabeth might have knelt here, her faith etched into the stone, filled him with a fierce determination to uncover the truth. He knew they could not proceed alone. The chamber's secrets demanded expertise beyond their reach. With Crow's agreement, James used his cell phone to contact the Woodhull Sheriff's Department, his voice steady as he described their find and urged immediate action. Within hours, a police team arrived, their vehicles kicking up dust along the overgrown path to the chapel. Deputies in crisp uniforms cordoned off the site, their radios crackling with updates as forensic specialists descended into the tunnel. James and the volunteers stood at a distance, watching as the officers carried equipment into the ruins, cameras, evidence bags, and portable lights that cast an eerie glow against the crumbling walls. The initial inspection confirmed the chamber's purpose. It had been used to confine human beings, likely for an extended period, based on the condition of the artifacts and the depth of the carvings. A young deputy, his face pale, emerged from the tunnel carrying a sealed bag containing the fabric scraps, his expression a mix of awe and unease. James, standing under the shadow of a gnarled oak, felt the weight of the discovery settle over him, a burden both sacred and unbearable. As the police worked, James retreated to the chapel's threshold, his gaze fixed on the open grate. He pulled the photograph of Elizabeth from his pocket, her youthful smile a stark contrast to the grim reality unfolding below. The crosses on the walls, the tattered cloth, the tallies, they were proof of her presence, her struggle, her enduring faith. Yet the chamber offered no answers about her fate, only questions that burned in his chest. Who had built this hidden prison? What malice had driven them to entomb 3 women devoted to God? James closed his eyes, his lips moving in silent prayer, beseeching divine guidance to illuminate the path ahead. The wind stirred the grass around him, carrying the faint scent of rain as the police continued their work, unaware of the priest's quiet vow to pursue the truth, no matter the cost. The police investigation, now a whirlwind of activity, shifted its focus from the desolate chapel to the broader landscape of Woodhull, seeking the architect of the underground chamber's grim purpose. Father James Thorne, standing on the periphery of the cordoned-off site, watched as deputies conferred in hushed tones, their faces taut with the weight of discovery. The forensic team's findings had confirmed the chamber's use as a place of confinement, and the carvings on its walls pointed unmistakably to the missing nuns. The land records, hastily retrieved from the county office, revealed a chilling detail. The hill and its chapel had been purchased in 1980, mere months after the nuns vanished, by Edward Lowell, a wealthy landowner whose name was both revered and whispered in Woodhull. Lowell, a reclusive figure in his late 60s, had cultivated an image as a philanthropist, funding the village's library and sponsoring scholarships for local youth. Yet, beneath this polished veneer, his past held shadows that the police now sought to illuminate. Investigators delved into Lowell's history, piecing together a portrait that grew darker with each revelation. In the 1970s, he had briefly aligned himself with fringe anti-religious groups, attending meetings in nearby cities where speakers railed against organized faith. More telling was the discovery of his personal tragedy. His mother, who had abandoned him as an infant in 1940, had later joined a convent, taking vows that severed her from the world, including her son. Raised by a stern aunt in a neighboring county, Lowell had grown up with a festering resentment, his mother's choice a wound that never healed. By the time he acquired the chapel's land, he had amassed a fortune through real estate, his wealth granting him influence that kept curious eyes at bay. To the police, these fragments suggested a motive rooted in deep-seated hatred, one that might have driven him to target the nuns of St. Catherine's. James, consumed by a sense of duty to his sister and her companions, resolved to confront Lowell himself. The police had cautioned against it, citing the need for procedural restraint, but James could not wait idly while the truth lingered just out of reach. He drove to Lowell's estate, a sprawling mansion set back from Woodhull's main road, its manicured gardens and wrought iron gates a stark contrast to the village's humble homes. The house, built of gray stone and timber, loomed like a fortress, its tall windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. James parked his modest sedan at the edge of the gravel drive, his clerical collar a quiet assertion of his purpose. He approached the front door, his steps measured, and knocked, his heart pounding with a mix of resolve and apprehension. When no answer came, he knocked again, his gaze drifting to the neatly trimmed hedges and a marble fountain that gurgled softly nearby. Finally, the door opened, revealing Lowell himself, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair combed back, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the priest. Lowell's demeanor shifted from guarded curiosity to open hostility as James introduced himself and mentioned the chapel. He denied any knowledge of the underground chamber, his voice sharp and dismissive, claiming the land had been vacant when he purchased it. When James pressed, asking about the nun's disappearance, Lowell's face flushed with anger, his hands clenching at his sides. He accused James of harassment, threatening legal action for slander and ordering him to leave. Yet, in the man's fleeting glances and the slight tremor in his voice, James sensed a nervousness that belied his defiance. The encounter, brief but charged, left James convinced that Lowell hid more than he revealed, his hostility a shield for secrets buried deeper than the tunnel beneath the hill. As James drove back to the rectory, the photograph of Elizabeth in his pocket felt heavier, a reminder of the stakes that drove him forward. Meanwhile, the police, armed with a search warrant obtained through mounting evidence, descended on Lowell's estate. Deputies moved methodically through the mansion's opulent rooms, their boots tracking mud across polished hardwood floors. In a locked study, hidden behind a false panel in a bookcase, they uncovered a cache of documents that sent a ripple of shock through the investigation team. Among the papers was a leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed but meticulously preserved, spanning decades of Lowell's life. The entries, written in a precise hand, began innocently enough, detailing business deals and social engagements. But as the police read further, a chilling narrative emerged, one that laid bare a mind consumed by vengeance. Lowell had fixated on the nuns of St. Catherine's, their piety a mirror of his mother's betrayal. He described watching the monastery for months, learning the nuns' routines, his obsession growing with each visit to the chapel. The diary revealed the meticulous planning behind the nuns' abduction. Lowell had posed as a neighborly benefactor, arriving at the chapel during their retreat with a thermos of tea, laced with a sedative he had procured through illicit channels. The nuns, trusting his generosity, had accepted the offering, unaware of its treachery. As the drug took hold, dulling their senses, Lowell had acted swiftly, binding their hands and moving them to the underground chamber he had constructed in secret. The tunnel, dug over months with hired labor dismissed as landscaping work, was his masterpiece, a hidden prison designed to break the women's faith. He wrote of his intent to strip them of their devotion, to prove that their God would not save them. The entries grew more erratic, detailing his visits to the chamber, where he taunted the nuns, offering freedom in exchange for renouncing their vows, a bargain none accepted. James, informed of the diary's contents by a sympathetic deputy, felt a wave of nausea at the thought of his sister enduring such cruelty. The police findings confirmed his worst fears. The chamber was no accident but a deliberate creation, its religious carvings a testament to the nuns' resilience, not their captors' mercy. Lowell's wealth and influence had shielded him, his purchase of the chapel land a calculated move to erase any trace of his crime. The investigation team, now bolstered by state authorities, prepared to confront Lowell, their case strengthened by the diary's damning evidence. James, standing outside the church as dusk settled over Woodhull, clutched his Bible, his prayers shifting from pleas for answers to supplications for justice. The truth, though painful, had begun to surface, and he steeled himself for the revelations yet to come, his sister's fate still a fragile hope in the gathering darkness. The investigation surged forward with relentless momentum, the discovery of Edward Lowell's diary igniting a fire under the Woodhull Sheriff's Department. Father James Thorne, standing outside St. Catherine's Church as twilight painted the sky, felt the weight of the unfolding truth, his prayers a quiet anchor amidst the storm. The police, armed with the diary's chilling confessions, secured an emergency warrant to search Lowell's sprawling estate, their resolve hardened by the evidence of his calculated cruelty. Deputies descended on the mansion, their vehicles lining the manicured drive, while forensic teams prepared to scour every corner of the property. James, though barred from participating, lingered in the village, his heart tethered to the hope that his sister, Elizabeth, might still be found, her fate no longer a distant mystery but a possibility within reach. The search began with the mansion's interior, officers moving through grand halls adorned with oil paintings and crystal chandeliers, their presence a stark intrusion into Lowell's curated world. Finding nothing in the main house, the team shifted to the outbuildings, their attention drawn to a nondescript shed nestled along a wooded path connecting the estate to the chapel hill. The shed, weathered and unassuming, appeared to be a storage space for gardening tools, its exterior cloaked in ivy. Yet, as deputies pried open its creaking door, they noticed inconsistencies. The floorboards, newer than the shed's aged walls, bore faint scuff marks, as if frequently disturbed. With crowbars and flashlights, they lifted the boards, revealing a hidden trapdoor, its iron hinges gleaming faintly in the dim light. Beneath it lay a second entrance to the underground complex, a discovery that sent a jolt through the investigation team. The trapdoor opened to a steep staircase, carved into the earth and reinforced with concrete. Descending into darkness, officers, equipped with tactical lights, navigated the passage, their beams illuminating a network of tunnels that branched off from the chapel's chamber. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of mold and confinement, as they followed the main corridor to a second chamber, smaller but similarly austere. There, on a thin mattress that sagged against the stone floor, lay Sister Elizabeth Thorne, her frail form barely distinguishable beneath a tattered blanket. Her face, gaunt and pale from decades without sunlight, bore the ravages of her ordeal, yet her eyes, though sunken, flickered with a spark of recognition as the light fell upon her. In her hands, she clutched a makeshift rosary, its beads carved from scraps of wood and strung with threads unraveled from her habit, a testament to her unbroken faith. The officers, stunned by the sight of a living survivor, moved with care, their training overriding their shock. Elizabeth, weakened but conscious, stirred slightly, her breathing shallow but steady. Nearby, in a shadowed corner of the chamber, lay the skeletal remains of two others, their bones partially covered by decayed fabric that matched the nuns' habits. The forensic team, arriving swiftly, identified the remains as likely belonging to Sister Margaret Wilson and Sister Clara Henderson, their deaths a silent tragedy etched into the chamber's grim history. Medics, summoned from the waiting ambulance, gently lifted Elizabeth onto a stretcher, their movements deliberate to avoid further harm. As they carried her to the surface, her rosary remained clasped in her fingers, a lifeline she refused to release. James, notified by a deputy who had seen the priest's anguish, rushed to the estate's perimeter, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and hope. He stood behind the police tape, his eyes fixed on the shed as the stretcher emerged, Elizabeth's fragile form a miracle he had scarcely dared to imagine. Her survival, after 25 years, defied comprehension, yet the sight of her emaciated body filled him with a profound sorrow for the suffering she had endured. He crossed himself, his lips moving in a silent prayer of gratitude for her life and supplication for the souls of Margaret and Clara, whose remains followed in somber procession, sealed in body bags for forensic analysis. The diary, now fully examined, laid bare the harrowing details of Lowell's actions. He had kept the nuns in separate chambers, isolating them to amplify their despair, his visits marked by psychological torment. He had withheld food and water for days, demanding they renounce their faith, his obsession rooted in a twisted desire to punish the piety he despised. Sister Margaret, the eldest, succumbed within months, her frail body unable to withstand the starvation and cold. Sister Clara, stronger but worn by grief, followed a year later, her death hastened by an untreated infection that ravaged her in the damp confines. Elizabeth, young and resilient, clung to life, her faith a shield against Lowell's cruelty. The diary noted her defiance, her whispered prayers infuriating him, yet he spared her, perhaps as a perverse trophy of his power. Lowell's arrest came swiftly, officers apprehending him in his study as he sat, impassive, surrounded by the trappings of his wealth. His face, once a mask of arrogance, betrayed no remorse, only a cold acceptance as handcuffs closed around his wrists. He offered no resistance, his silence a final act of defiance against the justice closing in. The police, combing through his records, uncovered financial transactions that hinted at bribes paid to local officials in the 1980s, ensuring his construction of the underground complex went unnoticed. The shed, built to conceal the second entrance, had been a later addition, its innocuous appearance a perfect disguise. James, standing in the churchyard as news of the arrest spread, felt a complex surge of emotions. The discovery of Elizabeth alive was a miracle, yet the loss of Margaret and Clara, and the horrors they had endured, weighed heavily on his soul. He knelt before the altar, his Bible open to the Psalms, and prayed for healing, for his sister, for the village, and for the strength to forgive the unforgivable. The rosary Elizabeth had crafted, now in the hands of the medics, became a symbol of her endurance, its crude beads a testament to a faith that had triumphed over darkness. As the police vans departed, carrying Lowell to a cell and Elizabeth to a hospital, James vowed to remain by her side, his mission no longer one of pursuit but of restoration, guided by the light of a truth finally revealed. The ambulance carrying Sister Elizabeth Thorne sped through the night, its sirens cutting through the quiet of rural Iowa as it raced toward Iowa City's University Hospital. Father James Thorne followed in his sedan, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his heart a tumult of gratitude and sorrow. The image of his sister, frail yet alive, lingered in his mind, her makeshift rosary a beacon of resilience that both humbled and inspired him. Behind him, the village of Woodhull receded, its lights dimming, but the weight of its shared history traveled with him. Edward Lowell's arrest and the discovery of the underground chambers had shaken the community, yet the miracle of Elizabeth's survival sparked a flicker of hope, a promise of healing after decades of unanswered grief. At the hospital, a team of doctors and nurses met the ambulance in the emergency bay, their movements swift and precise as they transferred Elizabeth to a gurney. Her condition, assessed en route, was dire. Severe malnutrition had withered her frame, her muscles atrophied from years of confinement, and her skin, untouched by sunlight, was translucent, marred by old scars and poorly healed fractures. Her immune system, compromised by prolonged isolation, posed a significant risk, and her eyes, accustomed to darkness, flinched at the harsh fluorescent lights. The medical staff, briefed on her extraordinary circumstances, worked with a quiet reverence, their clinical efficiency tempered by awe at her endurance. Elizabeth, though weak, remained alert, her fingers tracing the wooden beads of her rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer as she was wheeled to the intensive care unit. James arrived minutes later, his clerical collar askew from the hurried drive. A nurse, her expression kind but firm, intercepted him at the ICU entrance, explaining that Elizabeth's fragility required strict protocols. Visitors, even family, needed protective gear, masks, gowns, gloves to guard against infections that could prove fatal. James nodded, his impatience softened by the knowledge that his sister's life hung in a delicate balance. He donned the required attire, the rustle of the gown a strange accompaniment to his racing thoughts, and followed the nurse to a private room where Elizabeth lay, surrounded by monitors that beeped softly, their rhythms a fragile tether to her survival. Her face, though gaunt, bore the faint outline of the sister he remembered, and her eyes, though weary, held a clarity that pierced his heart. He sat by her bedside, his gloved hand resting lightly on hers, careful not to disturb the 4 lines that delivered nutrients and fluids. The hospital room, sterile and impersonal, became a sacred space as James opened his Bible, reading passages from the Psalms, their words of comfort mingling with the hum of medical equipment. Elizabeth, too weak to speak at length, listened, her gaze fixed on her brother, a faint smile curving her lips. In moments of rest, she conveyed fragments of her ordeal through gestures and whispered words, her memories a tapestry of suffering and faith. She had carved religious images into the chamber's walls, crosses, doves, the Virgin Mary, transforming her prison into a chapel, each stroke an act of defiance against her captor's cruelty. Her prayers, recited in the dark, had anchored her, and thoughts of James, their childhood games, and their parents' love had sustained her through the endless years. Woodhull, reeling from the revelation of Lowell's crimes, rallied around the church that had long been its spiritual core. The news of Elizabeth's survival spread swiftly, carried by phone calls and hushed conversations at the diner. Parishioners, many of whom had attended the annual memorial masses, gathered at St. Catherine's, their candles illuminating the sanctuary as they prayed for her recovery. Henry Cobb, the farmer who had first sounded the alarm, organized a fundraiser to restore the monastery of St. Catherine, its neglected halls a symbol of the community's loss. Donations poured in, from lifelong residents and strangers alike, each contribution a step toward reclaiming the monastery as a memorial to the nuns' steadfast faith. Volunteers cleared the overgrown garden, repaired the cracked stone walls, and polished the bell tower, their labor a collective act of renewal. Elizabeth's recovery, though slow, progressed under the hospital's care. Doctors adjusted her diet, introducing nutrients gradually to avoid overwhelming her system, and physical therapists guided her through gentle exercises to rebuild her strength. Her eyes, sensitive to light, required darkened glasses, and her voice, hoarse from disuse, gained clarity with each passing day. She expressed a resolute desire to return to her monastic life, her vocation undimmed by her ordeal. The thought of resuming her vows, of praying once more in a sanctuary free from chains, filled her with a quiet joy that James marveled at, his own faith deepened by her example. He spent hours at her side, sharing stories of their youth, racing through cornfields, building forts by the creek, each memory a bridge across the years that had separated them. The trial of Edward Lowell loomed on the horizon, its preparations dominating headlines across Iowa. Prosecutors, armed with the diary and forensic evidence, built a case that exposed not only his crimes but the web of corruption that had shielded him. Local officials from the 1980s, some still living, faced scrutiny for accepting bribes that silenced complaints about Lowell's secretive construction. The courtroom, when the trial began, became a focal point for the region, its proceedings televised and debated in homes and bars. Lowell, impassive in his tailored suit, offered no defense, his silence a final refusal to acknowledge the pain he had inflicted. The judge's gavel fell with a life sentence, a verdict that satisfied the law but left James and Elizabeth seeking a deeper resolution. For them, justice lay not in retribution but in forgiveness and healing, a path rooted in their shared faith. James, reflecting on the years of doubt that had tested his priesthood, found peace in Elizabeth's survival, seeing in it a divine purpose that transcended human understanding. Elizabeth, as her strength returned, spoke of her captor with pity rather than hatred, praying for his soul even as she mourned her lost sisters. The monastery of St. Catherine, its restoration nearly complete, welcomed her back in a quiet ceremony, its refurbished chapel filled with the scent of fresh paint and incense. The bells, silent for decades, rang out across Woodhull, their peals carrying a message of hope and rebirth. James, standing beside Elizabeth as she knelt in prayer, felt the weight of his grief lift, replaced by a gratitude that bound them to each other and to the community that had never forgotten. The monastery, once a place of loss, stood anew, its walls echoing with the promise of light after darkness.